Breaking books 12 to 16 down into sections. Okay, so I'll begin talking then. What I want to do is give a bit of an overview of sections 12 to 13, and along the way I want to introduce a non-traditional approach to reading the Zhuāngzǐ that I've been advocating for about 20 years. Many people attending this workshop probably already apply an approach along these lines, and if so, my contribution might be simply to help articulate this. This particular workshop is an excellent setting to do that, because the advantages of the approach are illustrated especially well when we apply it to the three Zhuāngzǐ heaven Piān, 12, 13, and 14. I sent Esther an email the other day kind of saying, I want to thank you for teaching me a word that I didn't know until recently, although I know some scholars in the field are using it. So a word borrowed from theology, pericope, taken from the Christian liturgical tradition, which refers to a single coherent section of a text that's suitable for reading on its own. Such as a gospel reading selected for a mass. And pericope is it's a convenient counterpart to the Chinese word zhang, and it's more precise than English words such as section or passage. So I'll use it today. I think in scholarly publications you can go ahead and use it, but I find that if it's a popular publication, it's probably too ugly a word, and we're better off using the word section. So a cornerstone of the approach that I want to advocate is that we take the basic unit of study and working with the Zhuāngzǐ to be the pericope, and not the Piān, not the group of Piān, nor certainly the entire Zhuāngzǐ anthology. The pericope was probably the most likely, primary unit of production and transmission of the Zhuāngzǐ materials. The Piān, of course, as we all know, was originally a physical unit, referring to the material that the texts were written on, and not a literary unit, referring to the organization of their content. And there are numerous uncontroversial examples of Piān that are not coherent literary units. Within the Zhuāngzǐ, Autumn Waters and Gengzang and Robert Zhi are obvious examples. And there are many other good examples outside the Zhuāngzǐ, especially in the Xunzi, where sometimes completely unrelated material has been placed together in the same Piān. So we have really strong reasons not to assume, in advance of working with the text, in advance of interpretation, that Piān ever form literarily coherent units. Maybe sometimes they do, but that's a status that we have to argue for rather than assume. I note that the pericope may not always have been the basic compositional building block, because there seem to be a number of rough notes sections in the Zhuāngzǐ. Section 6.2, 15.2, 23.2, these are all examples that suggest that the writers maybe sometimes first composed very short remarks and then worked them together like building blocks into longer pericopes. So I want to suggest that we understand and explain the Zhuāngzǐ corpus more fully when we work from the level of the pericope. And any insights stemming from relations between pericopes and groups of them collected into the same Piān, or between groups in different Piān, have to first be grounded in interpretation and explanation of individual pericopes. Now, that point may seem simple, but note that it vitiates several prominent previous attempts to explain the content and formation of the Zhuāngzǐ. If we take that point seriously, then well-known work by A.C. Graham and Liu Xiaogan is rendered almost irrelevant, because they both take the Piān as basic units. For example, the usage analysis in Graham's early work, How Much of the Zhuāngzǐ Did Zhuāngzǐ Write?, and almost all of Liu's claims in his book classifying the Zhuāngzǐ chapters about the implications of certain usage patterns in the text, both rely on taking the Piān as a basic unit, and I'm suggesting that the Piān is not a basic unit. In terms of the use of this concept of the pericope, I note that, of course, there are going to be a few instances where the boundaries of individual pericopes are unclear or disputable, but I don't see that as a problem. I think that's just a subject for discussion on a case-by-case basis. Okay, so that's one sort of starting background point. Another point is that a second feature of the approach that I advocate is that from what we know of the nature of the Zhuāngzǐ writings and the process by which they were produced and transmitted, authorship is largely irrelevant to their interpretation. It doesn't really matter who wrote the material. What matters is that it comprises hundreds of short pericopes produced at different times for different purposes that have apparently been mixed and matched by various editors and collectors or curators. And these pericopes are each discrete works and have to be interpreted as such. Now, in some cases, they may fit together as composite works. Someone might want to argue that certain parts of Xiaoyaoyou, Book 1, or Qi Book 2, have been edited to form a kind of composite whole. But even in such cases, interpretation has to build up from the level of the discrete pericope. And for the purpose of interpretation, it doesn't really matter who wrote them or how many people were involved, whether it was one person writing at different times, in different moods, under the influence of different substances, or a variety of people. The identity of the authors of the material may or may not be an intriguing historical question. I think it's an intractable one, but it has little relevance to interpretation of the content. Okay, so the third major feature of the approach I recommend is how I propose to contextualize the various pericopes that we study. All interpretation proceeds by drawing on contextual clues and by appealing to a wider context for guidance and justification. And in much interpretation, the immediate context we're going to look to in interpreting brief units of text is the coherent whole of which they are parts and the subdivisions of that whole. So in the case of a modern book, it's going to be the book and the chapters of the book. And in the case of the Zhuāngzǐ materials, we can't assume in advance of interpreting the pericopes that either the Piān in which they appear, or groups of Piān, or the entire corpus constitute a literarily or doctrinally coherent whole. So what's the larger whole that's going to provide the context for us to work from in interpreting individual pericopes? And my suggestion is that it should be the discourse or the conversation, by which I mean groupings of pericopes that overlap with respect to topics, issues, themes, values, motifs, and so on, that they're treating or responding to. As that very loose characterization suggests, pericopes can be treated as part of multiple discourses or conversations, which may intersect or crisscross or overlap in various ways. Contributions to a discourse don't need to present the same doctrinal stance. They may well disagree with each other, but to be part of the same discourse, they're going to share certain topics and concerns and concepts and certain background assumptions. They'll relate to each other in explicable ways, and these relations provide enough of a context that we can use it as a constraint in checking whether or not interpretations are reasonable. So a quick familiar example of what I have in mind is that we can treat all of the various Zhuāngzǐ pericopes touching on the motifs of use and uselessness, worth and worthlessness, as forming a kind of discourse about those topics. And everyone's familiar that those particular pericopes present a variety of ideas relating to those topics, and some of them actually seem to criticize each other. So they form a discourse or a conversation in which you have different pericopes floating different sorts of ideas, maybe taking up different positions, and other ones applying them differently or perhaps criticizing them. Another example might be to think of the many pericopes in the pre-Han literature that mention the correctness of names as forming a kind of discourse. Discourses, of course, could be framed narrowly or broadly. At a very broad level, for example, we could treat much of the content of the pre-Han master's texts as a very general discourse about the question of the best way to live. Okay. So I want to suggest that Piān 11 through 16 offer a number of examples of the value of this alternative approach that allow us to better understand, the approach allows us to better understand the range of material in these Piān and how it relates to other parts of the Zhuāngzǐ. Before giving some evidence for that claim, let me introduce a bit of terminology for some of the prominent doctrinal orientations or themes that I think help us to identify discourses or conversations in these pericopes in the Piān 12 through 14 or 12 through 16. So I'm going to use in a few places the term syncretic, and what I'm calling syncretic is a standpoint that combines a positive view of prevailing values such as benevolence and righteousness, with an emphasis on Dao and De, among other motifs. Syncretic views generally do not emphasize people's inherent nature or the figure of the ultimate person or genuineness. Another label, I'm not sure it's the best label, we'll work on that, is bureaucratic Laoism. I'll use that as a label for views on which the ruler alone is to practice Wu Wei, while the subordinates practice Yo Wei. And the Tao is seen as settling the divisions of names and associated roles and duties. Attention is devoted to forms and names, and rewards and punishments are endorsed. What we find in the text, I think, is that this family of views generally does not mention people's Xing, their inherent nature, or genuineness. Bureaucratic Laoism can be combined with syncretism, but it need not be. Different pericopes may present one or the other without combining them. Another term I want to introduce is Xing ethics, a family of views that reject prevailing values such as benevolence and righteousness. They deprecate the sage kings, the sages of the three dynasties, and they sometimes present a regressive view of history as a steady decline in people's virtue. They value people's inherent nature and as basic goods, and they use them as a kind of basic normative standard. Now, these views that I'm calling Xing ethics or contributions to a discourse in Xing ethics overlap what Graham dubbed primitivism, but I want to try to move beyond the label primitivism because I think not all Xing ethics endorses a return to some sort of simple primitive lifestyle. In fact, I think that's a minority view in the range of pericopes that are endorsing Xing as a basic source of value. Stillness discourse, this is a label for discussions that advocate attaining emptiness, stillness, and not action, such that you move only when pushed along by things in some way. Stillness discourse can be combined with bureaucratic Laoism, but it doesn't have to be. Another discourse would be genuineness discourse, which values the notion of zhen, maintaining or fulfilling what you really are or genuinely are. It sometimes intersects with what I'll call heaven discourse, pericopes that treat the relation between heaven and humanity, and usually value maintaining a certain sort of appropriate relation to heaven as a normative guideline. So one point I want to emphasize right away, having given that list of terms, is that there are really two key differences between some of the views that are up there. One is that Xing ethics is generally not compatible with syncretism or bureaucratic Laoism, and it's usually not associated with stillness discussions or with preserving genuineness. Okay, so with that terminology in mind, let me briefly look at how it compares with the classifications that Graham and Beale introduced. So Graham, of course, dubbed parts of Piān 11 to 15 syncretistic, but he was very careful in the way that he used that label. He noted that the label applies to only certain portions of the material. And he said that these Piān actually contain all kinds of miscellaneous material. So he noted, for example, that section 1215 is primitivist in his terminology. So he proposed that the syncretist pericopes are just a subset. I have a list of them, but it's basically the first couple in books 12 and 13, possibly the first one in 14, and the last one in book 11. Graham also includes Zhuāngzǐ 33, but I think that calls for different treatment, so I'm going to omit that for the time being. Now, what I'm going to suggest below is that even the group of pericopes that Graham considers syncretist should probably be subdivided into different overlapping discourses. Liu Xiaogan labels Piān 11 through 16 Huanglao. However, apparently what Liu means by Huanglao, if I understand him, is simply what Graham means by syncretic. Liu claims, falsely, as we will see, that all of these Piān collectively exhibit I quote here, appreciation for and tolerance for values from various schools of thought, by which he would include benevolence, righteousness, ritual, and law, and the Maoist universal love, as he understands it. Now, that's at least partly what Graham meant by syncretistic, Liu sees this sort of eclecticism as matching Sima Tan's description of Taoism, and Sima's Taoism, he suggests, is just what we now call Huanglao, and that's why he's going to label all of these Piān Huanglao. Now, Graham points out that parts of 12 through 14 overlap with what Graham thinks of as primitivist writing, but Liu disagrees and holds that this group of Piān is sharply distinct from Zhuāngzǐ 8 through 11a. As I'll show in a moment, that's just a mistake. Strangely, Liu does recognize that the Piān 12 contains at least 2 pericopes that are similar in content to 8 through 10, but he dismisses these as insignificant. I note that Liu's use of the term Huanglao seems at odds with the way the Shiji uses it in Shiji 63, where it applies to Shenbuhai and Hanfei, neither of whom I think had much appreciation for benevolence, righteousness, and universal love. My own view is that, I suggest that since the reference of the term Huanglao is both very vague and deeply contested, it's not a very helpful analytic label to use in examining Zhuāngzǐ materials, so I just set it aside here. Okay, now in the table I distributed, and I'm sorry if that looks really, really complicated, I know it is. What I've done is just tried to identify pericopes stretching from the last section of Piān 11 through to 16 and give them a very inadequate, brief characterization of some of the major themes that we find in them using the labels that I just introduced. And I certainly am not going to try to give an exhaustive discussion of that table. I'm just going to draw attention to a few prominent points that emerge from it, which I think are very interesting. And if anyone is curious about the section numbers I'm using, I've given the HY lines for them, and I have a translation of these chapters that uses those section numbers. So if you'd like to see the translation, just let me know. Okay, well, an obvious observation from that table is that Graham was right to emphasize the very heterogeneous nature of these Piān. And indeed, of the 36 pericopes in that table, only 5 of them are syncretic in the sense that I defined, which is a little narrower than Graham's definition. Only 3 or 4 of them appear to endorse bureaucratic Laoism. It's possible that the syncretic and the bureaucratic Laoist material might be linked to others through motifs such as Diwang the virtue of emperors and kings. That's a relation that is worth looking into further. Graham was also obviously right to notice that section 1215 is what he called primitivist, insofar as his use of that term generally identifies texts that fall within the discourse of Xing ethics. In fact, of the 35 pericopes in 12 through 16, 8 of them can be classified as part of the Xing ethics discourse. Because these 8 reject mainstream ethical values such as benevolence, they contrast really sharply with the pericopes expressing syncretic views, right? So syncretic views affirm the value of benevolence and righteousness and so on, and the Xing discourse rejects it. So this stark opposition between the syncretic and the Xing ethics pericopes, I would say, decisively undermines any interpretive or analytical approach that takes the Piān as a basic unit. That the Piān as wholes cannot accurately be characterized as syncretic or, for that matter, as Huanglao. They cannot be regarded as collections of material that supports or illustrates or elaborates on some initial syncretic or bureaucratic Laoist view that's presented in the first section of the Piān. Their content is just fundamentally diverse, and it's riven by disagreement over the status of values such as benevolence. Okay, looking again at the pericopes that form a discourse on Xing, we can also remove an unfortunate distortion introduced by classifications such as Graham's and Liu's that isolate the material in 8 through 10 from other Zhuāngzǐ writings. Because if we look at this long list of passages that assign some sort of normative significance to Xing, throughout the entire Zhuāngzǐ. We notice that they run from Piān 8 all the way up to 29, but they're heavily concentrated in the band between 8 and 16. So what I want to suggest is that that list forms a discourse that draws together books 8 through 10 with pericopes from the Heaven books and the Mending Nature book, and a few from other highly miscellaneous Piān, in other regions of the Zhuāngzǐ. And my proposal, this sort of discourse approach that I'm suggesting, is that all of those should be read together as part of an extended late Warring States or early Han conversation about the role of Xing in ethics and moral psychology, and how it relates to norms such as benevolence, among other topics. And of course, more broadly, read that Zhuāngzǐ discourse as part of a wider conversation about Xing that's going to include portions of Mengzi, Xunzi, and Lü Shi Chunqiu. So I'm not suggesting that all of those Zhuāngzǐ pericopes about Xing are going to converge in presenting a single unified doctrine. What I'm suggesting is that they cohere as contributions to a kind of very prominent conversation or discourse. And if we bifurcate that discourse by considering some of the pericopes a distinct primitivist set of writings, and others part of a supposedly syncretic or set of writings, we risk overlooking how they actually cohere as a discourse and how they're actually distinct from other parts of other pericopes in the Heaven books and across the entire Zhuāngzǐ. So I want to suggest not only that the Heaven books are, fundamentally disunified, but also that drawing a boundary between, what Graham called the primitivists and this material is potentially very badly misleading because it might lead readers to neglect the deep connections between portions of these books and 8 through 10 or 8 through 11. So instead, I suggest we look at them as a continuous discourse. Similar observations about context hold if we want to try to explore and understand the relation between Zhuāngzǐ material and Dao De Jing material. The Zhuāngzǐ pericopes with particularly close connections to the Dao De Jing are the ones I've listed here. And what we can see right away is that there's a pretty significant overlap between this list and the one I just displayed. So, some of the voices that are being expressed in that discourse about Xing are also very interested in ideas coming out of the Dao De Jing. And of course, that's pretty interesting insofar as Xing doesn't even occur in the Dao De Jing. Right? Xing is not part of the conceptual vocabulary in play in the Dao De Jing. So again, I want to suggest that focusing on a Piān level, a book level distinction between the Heaven Piān and the supposedly primitivist ones, and the ones that Liu and Graham labeled transmitters or school of Zhuāngzǐ, is going to tend to obscure the close relations between the Piān that are in that particular list that I've got on the screen right now. Okay, now it's also intriguing to note, of course, that no pericopes from the inner Piān or 17 or most of 19, 2021, 24 through 32, none of those have appeared on the couple of lists that I just put up. And it's interesting that many of the major themes and motifs familiar from those parts of the Zhuāngzǐ corpus don't show up in Piān 12 through 16. For example, if you do a search through the whole Zhuāngzǐ on the concept of you, wandering, it shows up literally dozens of times. But it's either minor or absent from Piān 12 through 16. Only one pericope really emphasizes it in any way. None of them treat issues such as perspectives or dependence. There's no skeptical questioning. There are no colorful stories about disease, deformity, and death. There's no wrestling with the practical difficulties of service as there are in Book 4 and Jianshi. There's only one dialogue in these books with Zhuāngzǐ as a character. There's only one skill story, the wheelwright story, which of course in this context seems unrelated to any other material in 12 through 13. Across the entire Zhuāngzǐ, Confucius is treated positively in roughly half of his appearances. I think it's actually a little more than half. And of course, Confucius is by far the most commonly occurring Zhuāngzǐ character. He appears in about 50 pericopes across the Zhuāngzǐ, more than any other character. But in 12 through 16, all the appearances of Confucius are exclusively negative. And that's a distinctive feature of this group of pericopes. Of course, the Confucius-Laodan dialogues should be considered a discourse of their own. And one feature of that discourse is the deprecatory treatment of Confucius. And many of those dialogues fall within these several piān. Okay. Now, by contrast with, I just mentioned the Xing discourse and the Dao De Jing allusions, which are fairly frequent in these piān, and that they tie them to 8 through 10, and that a lot of that material doesn't overlap with 1 through 7 at all. Okay. Well, here's a theme that does overlap with some of the material in 1 through 7. So by contrast with the Xing discourse and the Dao De Jing allusions, there are 3 pericopes from the Heaven Piān that fit very well into a discourse that does include material from the inner Piān, and that would be 7, Piān 7, Ying Di Wang, fit for emperors and kings. Now, Graham, of course, conjectured that whoever produced the Heaven Piān may have had a hand in editing the inner Piān, or possibly were the people who chose the 3 character titles for them, because, of course, key terms such as zong and shi and di wang occur in the text of the Heaven Piān and then also in the titles of books 6 and 7. I think that's a very plausible conjecture, but it's hard to really justify it in any way because there are too many equally plausible scenarios that we can imagine. But still, there does seem to be a very close relationship between 7 and 12. And what I would suggest is that pericopes number 12.9, 12.10, and 12.12 easily fit into a discourse with 7.2 and 7.4, and I would probably include 7.3 as well. And there are many structural and substantive resemblances between them. If an ancient editor had inserted those 3 pericopes from Book 12 into Book 7, I don't think anybody would ever have noticed. They would have assumed that fit together as a discourse. 12.9 shares phrasing and a rhetorical structure with 7.4. In fact, they seem almost variants of the same basic anecdote. 7.4 is framed to address an enlightened king, and 12.9 is phrased to address the sage. But other than that, they're quite similar. 12.10 resembles 7.2 in having a character present conventional political advice, which is then ridiculed by another character who offers alternative advice, and it presents a description of how the sage governs that overlaps the descriptions in 7.2 and 7.4 and actually shares some phrasing. It describes sagely governance in a manner that echoes 7.2, and 12.10 shares the praying mantis analogy that we see in section 4.3. So in contextualizing these pericopes from Book 12, we want to consider, how they fit into their immediate context. They use, for example, the terminology of Di Wang, and they share that with sections like 13.1 and 13.3. But we also want to look at how they relate to the political material in Book 7, and they should probably be read alongside it. So I think they're part of the same discourse as the material in Book 7. Okay. I think I've got one more major example to look at here. I'm going to call this the stillness discourse. These are the sections that begin Book 13. In terms of their relations to other texts, 13.1 and 13.2 are probably among the most complex pericopes in the entire Zhuāngzǐ corpus. They constitute major nodes in what I would call the stillness discourse, which draws together pericopes from Zhuāngzǐ and then also from the Guanzi Xinshu essay from Han Feizhi Book 5 and Lü Shi Chunqiu. The water and mirror metaphors that we find in section 13.1 also connect it to pericopes such as 5.1 and 5.4. So there's a bit of interaction between 13 and 5. Other Zhuāngzǐ pericopes that we might associate with this stillness discourse are the list that I've got up there. 13.2 in particular is just a remarkably composite assemblage of texts. It introduces a concept of heavenly happiness, which it then expounds through several reused bits of text that it borrows from section 6.8 of the inner Piān, and then ties the whole package back to the stillness motif of section 13.1. It's also notable in that 13.2 is the only section that provides an attribution within the Zhuāngzǐ corpus of a known piece of Zhuāngzǐ content to an authorial Zhuāngzǐ figure when it quotes that line about my master, from section 6.1. And of course, in 6.1, that's in the mouth of the character Xu You, and here it's put in the mouth of Zhuāngzǐ. So that's pretty interesting. Now, in its immediate context here, 13.2, those sentences are recontextualized to offer an exposition of heavenly happiness that bears no relation whatsoever to the content of 6.8. And that notion of heavenly happiness is then tied to material taken from section 15.2, which I consider a scratch paper section, a scratch pad or scratch paper section of the corpus. And intriguingly, section 15.2 also seems to be a major source for Huainanzi Jingshen Pian, Huainanzi Book 7. The theme of setting or fixing the mind and reigning over the world also link 13.2 to two of the master said pericopes in the three heaven Pian. So the references to the virtue of emperor kings and reigning over the world in 13.1 and 13.2 are obviously intended to position these texts as having a political dimension. And presumably the reuse and the reinterpretation of the quotation borrowed from section 6.8 is intended to imply that the ideal ruler's relation to the world should be modeled on that of the Tao as described back in 6.8. And I think that conception of the ruler in some respects also complements what we see in section 7.4. Now, I was saying that maybe we should sort of subdivide Graham's notion of syncretism into the narrower notion of syncretism I offer and this idea of bureaucratic Laoism. And one of the reasons I suggested that is that 13.1 and 13.2 may be compatible with bureaucratic Laoism, which I identify with something like 11.7, but their stance is distinct from it. And for example, in 13.1, there's no implication that Wu Wei is restricted to only the ruler. Instead, they seem to present a political application of a broader conception of responsive agency focusing on stillness. And that conception is distinct from the sort of adaptive, responsive conception of agency that you see in, for example, the skill stories or the mind fasting pericope 4.1 or autumn waters or some of the material in Qi Wu Lun Book 2. So it seems, its own thing, basically. It's another partly intersecting but distinct theme and perhaps discourse. So without attempting to tie together all of the very messy threads poking out of sections 13.1 and 13.2, let me suggest that in those sections, we're probably looking at a sample from a Qin Han discourse about sagely cultivation and agency that the writer is attempting to promote as applicable to rulership, among other roles. It regards Zhuāngzǐ as an authoritative figure, and so it quotes him and puts some words in the mouth of Zhuāngzǐ. It attests that some of the material now found in Piān 6 was already attributed to Zhuāngzǐ as an authorial namesake. It presents views that share family resemblances with, but are clearly distinct from views about action and agency found in other parts of the Zhuāngzǐ corpus. And in fact, these views are more closely related to certain sections of the Lü Shi Chunqiu and the Guanzi than they are to much of the other Zhuāngzǐ material. So I see 13.1 and 13.2 as underscoring the complexity and the heterogeneity of the material in the three heaven books. We're looking at a really wide-ranging and rich collection of diverse writings here that don't tie together into any sort of neat, coherent package, and as a whole resist any kind of general label or characterization. So I see the Heaven Piān as epitomizing the anthological nature of the Zhuāngzǐ corpus as a whole. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Chris. I think there are, so interesting proposal. So I believe in the floor, there are many questions. So I will collect the question and discussion from the floor first.
In any case,
Chris, can you see Esther? You can see.
No.
It's all right. It's all right. You can hear me though, right?
If I stop the screen sharing, the picture will get bigger though.
Oh, yeah.
Let me stop that. Yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much for that really complex, interesting presentation. It was a lot to absorb, so I'm still kind of absorbing it. But of course, I'm not going to disagree with you about the use of pericope, ugliness aside. I have a kind of a quibble while other people are thinking of questions. I'm just wondering how you identify a Xing discourse and then you identify a Zhen discourse. And I guess when I've been reading the Xing discourse, I've been thinking of it as very tied up with talking about Zhen. It's almost like your Xing, like when you do the right thing for your Xing, it is preserving Zhen. So I'm curious about why you divide those into two different things.
Okay, so I want to suggest that this discourse idea is inherently very helpful, but inherently kind of messy and vague. So you're going to have certain discourses that overlap in various ways. And one thing I'm kind of sorry about is that the PowerPoints just now and the table don't adequately bring out the prominence of the concept of Zhen in the three heaven chapters, because it shows up quite a bit in these chapters. And I don't want to call them chapters, I'll call them books. And so why did I distinguish them? No doubt, you are absolutely right that in some of the pericopes, there's this really tight relation between Xing and Zhen, and Xing is sort of the key to fulfilling whatever Zhen is, right? But I think that then there are other pericopes out there that only treat Zhen and they don't treat Xing. And that's my reason for distinguishing them. Yeah, so I see them as we're going to want to look at the ones that treat Zhen, and we're going to find a variety of ideas about what that is. An obvious example would be Zhen is absolutely crucial in the fisherman story, and it shows up in a pivotal way toward the end of the Autumn Waters dialogue, right? And neither of them talk about Xing. And that's a nice example of how the fisherman in particular is a nice example of how these general labels that both Graham and Liu introduced are inherently misleading. They will actually point people in the wrong way in understanding the content of the corpus. Because, of course, Graham labeled the fisherman story a kind of, he grouped it under the label of Yangism. But the key normative, theme in there seems to be Zhen, at least in some parts of it. And then what's interesting is that if you look at, say, horses' hooves, obviously their Xing and Zhen are really tightly tied together, and then you look at the fishermen and they're not. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, Chris, this is Frank.
Hi, Frank.
That was really, really great. And I agree with you, and I think I just maybe think the Piān has slightly more weight than you're giving it, maybe. So I have a couple of questions, but I'll just start with one. It seems like there are some Piān that might be pericopes. That word, I've never actually heard it said. In my head, it's always been pericopes. I gotta correct myself as I say it. So, for example, the one I'm presenting on, 16, I kind of think it's one whole piece. My impression of 15 was that it's one whole piece, but I haven't looked at that very carefully. But say chapter 8 reads pretty easily as one whole piece.
Yes.
So, if you give absolutely no weight to the fact that they're right next to each other in one Piān, then that might support separating them, right? So I'm probably giving a little bit of weight to the fact that these are like in order in a chapter. Yeah. But could you say a little bit about that decision to present, say, those chapters as multiple pericopes rather than as
actually
one unit?
I don't. I mean, I personally don't. So I agree that there are a few Piān that are pericopes, right? And so the really obvious example is a Persuasion on Swords. Right, so the sword fighting thing, that's one story, and that's one Piān. And if you read Esther's recent wonderful contribution, along with that of Lo Kung, in that massive anthology edited by Kim Chong, they both call attention to archaeological findings. And of course, we've got an archaeological finding, I think it's the Zhāngzǐ one, that where we have a robber Zhi story as one Piān dug up from the ground, right? Okay, so we know that sometimes stories were out there circulating on their own as a Piān, for sure. And so probably 8, it's probably that's probably what that was. And 8 shows some sign of editing, but like it might have originated as 3 paragraphs that were tied together, or it might not. Who knows? But it does look like someone's arranged that to be a work of its own. I'd certainly agree with that. And maybe 10. I have to take another look at 10. So certainly, some of the time. But in that case, I think what we're doing is we're looking at it and saying, well, this does seem to be a literary whole. So it falls under the point I made that I don't for a moment think that we're all going to instantly agree on the boundaries of the pericopes. So if you think back to a passage everyone's familiar with in Book 2, Qi Lun, the dialogue between, the tree and the bird, and there's a lot of disagreement about commentators as to where it ends, right? For instance, when they go on to talk about, suppose we get into a debate with each other, is that part of the preceding conversation or is that a new bit? And there are a variety of opinions, and all of them are reasonable. I mean, even when we disagree with each other, we certainly acknowledge that it could be read that way, couldn't it? So I don't see those as as a serious problem. It's just that we have to acknowledge there are places where defining the pericope isn't going to be that easy. And I also want to suggest that the material in Xiao Yao You, was that selected for a purpose because somebody thought it kind of presented a certain point of view, even though it's individual pericopes? Leave it open for discussion. Maybe. I mean, it's not tightly edited, but it's certainly a reasonable position to take that. Someone hoped that by arranging these things together, they were going to project a certain standpoint. That's possible. Whereas I would look at the first half of Book 4 and say that's just a collection of things with interrelated themes.
Can I ask another
So
question?
to tie up, I agree with you.
Yeah.
Okay, so this question is maybe more complicated. So you presented, a list of chapters 12 to 16, things that are missing there, right? So there's no skeptical questioning, a kind of whole list, various characteristics that, let's say, seem to be beyond coincidentally similar, right? When you contrast those chapters to chapters 1 through 7, or the other ones that you put together. So it seems like there is some organizational principle behind that grouping into Piān, and even the grouping of the Piān together in the Zhuāngzǐ, right? So that doesn't have to be, I mean, certainly I don't think it's by school or by author. I mean, I agree with you on that. It could just be simply time period, you know, or interest.
Yeah.
I don't know. So I'm wondering so the first part of the question is what you think might be the organizational principle that explains why there actually are these kind of consistent differences. And the second one would be if you think that could then have any weight in how we interpret the particular pericopes, right? So once we know, like, okay, these were actually put together for some kind of reason, you might argue that that actually gives us some reason for, say, reading them within the context of those chapters first. So again, very weak reason, so one that could be very easily defeated by other factors, but that there'd still be some reason why you should at least initially think they might go together.
Yeah, I want to leave that open as a possibility, and I think it would be, you know, terribly unreasonable, dogmatic not to. So the point that I want to push is that if there's a particular region of the text where I have this interpretive hypothesis that it's been arranged in a certain way to make some broader point. So the stuff is from multiple origins, but someone has pieced it together because they wanted to create a collage of a certain kind. And this collage has a point to it that editor was trying to put across. You know, I think it would be very hard to justify that, but it should certainly be open as you know, a question that we can consider and work on. And the only point that I would want to push is that whatever the justification is going to be, it's going to have to be built up from the individual pericope rather than assumed. Right. That's the only point I would make. I do think that, you know, there are plenty of places where the compilation of the material is near random, especially. So I've just finished a translation of the whole thing, and especially in some of the mixed chapters, some of the really annoying stuff that, you know, it doesn't seem to relate to anything whatsoever. Looks kind of random. That was somebody's notebook, basically. But there are other places where clearly there's a thematic selection going on. And then I think, Frank, that part of your question, what you were starting with was, so I put up that list of Dao De Jing relations and I put up a list of Xing stuff, right? And so there are two striking things about it. One is what it draws together and the other is what it leaves out. And you have to think, is all this stuff coming from like a different group of people? Maybe, you know, and then you look at the Zhuāngzǐ quotations in the Lü Shi Chunqiu. Is any of the Xing stuff in there? I'd have to double check. My guess is no. My guess is that none of that Xing stuff shows up in the Lü Shi Chunqiu. Now, one possibility is that it didn't exist yet. That's certainly possible. The other is the Zhuāngzǐ stuff that's in the Lü Shi Chunqiu, setting aside Book 28, which is a special case, is, you know, somebody with that material in their possession went to, you know, the Qin capital and joined in the assembly of scholars organized by Lü Buwei. And that person had certain doctrinal, or people, it was probably a circle, had certain doctrinal affiliations, and maybe Xing was not one of them. In terms of discourses, too, I should also point out, so there's a discourse I didn't talk about. Maybe it should be connected up with the Xing discourse or overlaps with it in some way, and that would be the nurturing life discourse, which shows up in the Lü Shi Chunqiu. And this is a nice example of what I have in mind by discourses. So obviously the Cook Ding story is part of the nurturing life discourse because it explicitly labels itself as such. But the ideas in the Cook Ding story are not at all what we're accustomed to from the stuff in the Lü Shi Chunqiu about nurturing life, right? So it's almost like a commentary or a response to that material. It doesn't appear to agree with them very much, yet it's, you know, whoever's writing it is positioning it as commenting on that or offering an alternative view on that.
Thank you.
Since the microphone is already here, hi, Chris, do you hear me?
Yes.
Nice to meet you, by the way.
Yes, we've never spoken.
So As you were giving your presentation, I was thinking about what would be the difference between dividing up the Zhuāngzǐ by pericopes versus threads, which is how I used to teach and talk about the text, not chapters or clusters of chapters, like primitives,
Yeah.
etc., but in terms of threads organized around themes or attitudes towards themes. Although
Yeah.
I do think that some chapters maybe, I also do read chapter 15 possibly as a composite whole, but I can also talk about in terms of a thread. So one difference might be that we already have this native notion of Zhuāng, and periscopy maybe squarely corresponds to that notion better than thread. And maybe the other difference is that when you talk about threads, I mean, it can infinitely be multiplied, how many threads that are in Zhuāngzǐ.
Yeah.
Whereas with periscopy, you make the claim that there are 35, 36. It seems that you are also making a more structured, like organizational claim. Other than these two, what would be the difference, I guess, between pericopes, talking about in terms of pericopes versus threads, or is it?
Yeah,
just these
I
two?
think that the way you're using the word thread, it might be exactly what I'm saying by discourse. And so sometimes I say strains of discourse, strings of discourse, threads of discourse, lines of discourse. So I think actually we might be talking about exactly the same thing. So what are the components of the thread? I would say those are the pericopes, right? So again, book 4 is a nice example. It presents us with it's a really nice example in that how many threads are there in book 4? Well, you could say 1, or you could say 2, or possibly 3. And that's how we want to use this concept, right? We can say that the first 3 sections of book 4, that's one thread, but in a way we can tie that to the thread made up of the rest of book 4. And the first 3 sections are 3 pericopes that fit together as a thread.
This is very helpful. Thank you.
And I actually, another, an advantage to your use of that word thread is that it may trigger to people to think about online discussion forums and the notion of a thread in an online discussion forum, right? And that's exactly what we want people to think of, because there are definite analogies here between somebody putting up a post and then each of us commenting on it in some way, and all of the comments being anonymous, and you might say something and I might comment and agree on it, and somebody 500 years from now looking at it can't tell that it's 2 different people talking because they agree with each other, and then somebody else might say, yes, but, and then recontextualize what we were just saying and make some other point. And presumably that sort of thing is sometimes happening in the Zhuāngzǐ.
Since we're going around the room in order, great paper, great presentation. I just have a question about, what you say is undoubtedly true, right? Because, and this has been understood at least from the times of Liu Xiang, right? When he talks about, or in the records that are left down, say for the Yanzi Chunqiu, right? When he was establishing a definitive edition of this, he said, I have such and such number of Piān and such and such number of Zhāng, and it's very clear that the Piān and Zhāng existed in different configurations, right?
Yeah.
So one thing, what I'm trying to still wrap my head around is how did these come about, and how do these first transmit, or first transmitted in written form? So now we have a chapter like, let's say, Tiandi, that clearly has different, it's very eclectic, let's say. There's different sources for the individual Zhāng. But how do these come to be first transmitted in written form? Do say, like, do you imagine that there was first some group of teacher disciples had written down Piān that originally did cohere together more closely and were later reconfigured for whatever editorial reasons, or anything you can, any perspective you have on that question?
Yeah, I mean, we're all puzzled by that, right? So we can remind ourselves that sometimes they didn't write on Piān, they wrote on T, right? So some of the time you've got this shorter unit of bamboo strips. And I think that we probably, as we move into the early Han in particular, we've probably got a number of different types of readership. So, I suspect that some parts of the Zhuāngzǐ were looking at material that originated from teacher student groups or groups of friends. And my own reckless hypothesis about this is that the Zhuāngzǐ stories show us who the Zhuāngzǐ writers are. That's just a crazy thing for me to say, but what I mean by that is, okay, the groups of eccentric friends in Dazhongshi and the circles of teachers and followers in the Chongfu, so Zheng Zichan and the guy with the chopped off foot are studying under, who are they studying under? Bohe Wu Ren, is that their teacher? And so obviously all these, with the exception of Zheng Zichan, these are fictional characters, but a crazy hypothesis is maybe the fictional characters do kind of represent the sort of thing that was going on, and the writings are originating from groups like that. And so some of the time, we've probably got, either master-student transmissions, or we've got circles of friends, devotees of a certain way of life, who are writing and composing texts and sharing them and recopying each other's contributions and then passing them down to their students or their descendants. And so that model probably works, but in a very loose way, not like it would for the Mohists or for the Analects, for instance. And then I think that there's also probably some stuff that's just sort of literary appreciation. Somebody wrote something and their friend copied it and they passed it around. And you might go to you might go visit someone and peruse their library. Esther put this in her paper. Suppose somebody comes and peruses their library and says, "Can I copy a bit of this stuff?" And the owner of the scroll says, "Yeah, why not?" And they copy random selections. And probably they're not doing the copying. I mean, they probably all got a shutong who's doing it for them. But they copy random selections onto the same pian, and so that way they combine material that was originally separate. So, I mean, that's one likely hypothesis. When we're looking at Tiandi Pian, for example, some sort of hypothesis like that is needed, right? Because it's just such an amazing mix of material. And also, when we're looking at section 11.7, that tail end section of 11, where 11 starts off with this stuff that's in this Xing discourse, and then it's got this thing on the bottom that I call bureaucratic Laoism, that idea that Wu Wei is practiced only by the ruler, and everybody below him isn't practicing Wu Wei. And that's so fundamentally different from the rest of that chapter. And that's a nice little piece where you can see, okay, it's this fairly large piece that would have taken up a whole t that someone has tacked on to the end of that pian. It's too bad we don't have a report from Liu Xiang for the Zhuāngzǐ. So we do for Xunzi, for instance, and we don't for the Zhuāngzǐ. The one report that I would kind of call our attention to is that Guo Xiang alternative preface that Lu Deming is obviously quoting from word by word, and that showed up at Zhuāngzǐ in Kyoto. And I've read a few research papers on it that argue pretty convincingly that it's genuine. And within it, Guo Xiang himself mentions both pian and the unit he uses is shou. So the modern unit would be zhang, and the unit he's using is shou, like yi shou shi. And he says he moved these around, or that he excised some of these. So he's explicitly telling us that some of the material he cut out of the Zhuāngzǐ was not pian length, it was a shorter unit. And I think that's very valuable information. And that also hints that, maybe some of the 33 pian we're looking at now contain material that was moved around by Guo himself. Yeah, and we can never rule out that hypothesis, can we?
Thanks.
Okay. I think we have discussed about what pericope means, and then whether we can. Any question?
Hi, Chris.
Hi, Wim. How are you?
Thank you. Very, very, very well. Thank you. So I have a question. I think I agree, kind of agree that the pericope is probably the basic unit from which you have to build up a kind of a reading. But isn't it also the case that when you have one and the same pericope, that we can see different things in one and the same pericope? So for example, if I'm interested in Xing, I would maybe focus on Xing and I would single that out as a topic or as an important concept, while someone else may say, well, the reason why Xing appears is because of this other topic, and that other person may then select that topic as the main topic of this pericope.
Yeah.
And so there's a certain question about how do we identify the theme of the pericope, and depending on what we read in the pericope, we're going to put pericopes into different threads.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so the question is there any methodology that, okay, if we all agree that the pericope is like a basic unit, how do we go from there? Is it just based on, oh, I happen to do research on this concept, so I put these together, or this is my intuition, I put these together? How do we continue there?
Yeah.
And
Okay. So I think
maybe
yeah.
I'll give one example because I'm going to present something on chapter 13. So, for example, the wheelwright story, which you here say is you read it in terms of skill, and I think that's how we normally read it. And then if you read it in terms of skill, we put it together with Piān and maybe some of these Dasheng scenarios there, the skill stories there. But you could also argue that the reason why skill comes up in the rewrite story is because it gives a defense of a claim that what is included in the books is not at all important. It makes an argument from the impossibility of conveying embodied experience to say that what is in books is not at all important. And if you think that books becomes then the main topic of that small pericope, then you come to the further observation that, for example, out of the 20 occurrences of Shu in the entire Zhuāngzǐ, 8 of those appear in Tian-Da. And then you find other connections that may give more weight to the Piān there. So my question is a little bit, you see, so you have a pericope, but what do you identify as the central element of a pericope that allows you to bind it together with other pericopes into a thread? And is there any methodology there, or is it just like, well, anything goes? Or I mean, that is also possible. That is also possible. It's not negatively, but how do we progress from there?
So I think that some of them very obviously are going to belong in like more than one thread of discourse, and so like just now the question about Xing and Zhen, that's a good example in that there's going to be a discourse about Zhen, and there's going to be a discourse about Xing, and we'll see they're going to intersect because there are some pericopes that tie those two very tightly together, and then there are others that don't. And we want to look at both of that. It's all informative and it's all very interesting, right? So that's one sort of case. Whether they overlap, there's no conflict between them. With the wheelwright story, I think we can read it alongside the skill stories. So there isn't really a conflict there. But of course, I agree with you, and this is absolutely fundamentally important in understanding why the wheelwright story is where it is that it's been attached to that preceding little paragraph about speech and books and the value of whatever is in those things. And it's supposed to illustrate this stuff about the inability to pass down, the actual practice of whatever it is in words. So I think that's a really good example that you're offering. So my answer to the more general question is sort of like let 100 flowers bloom, and let's argue about it. Like maybe I contextualize it in a certain way, and you think actually that's misleading. If you do it that way, you're going to overlook something, and you marshal an argument and you give reasons to show why that's the case. And what's the methodology? Well, the methodology of all interpretation is inference to the best explanation. So, we're always trying to take all relevant information, what it is, and come up with an explanatory hypothesis that gives the simplest and most coherent, and we hope most fruitful explanation of the observations we make about the stuff in the text. And so, a very standard way to support what we're doing there is to say, okay, looking through this is what I really think is going on here, and here are my reasons. And then maybe to rebut what I or somebody else has said by pointing out other observations that they haven't noticed. So like you just pointed out a really interesting observation that there's this concentration of interest in the term shu, in one particular one of these Piān. Well, that's interesting. So, maybe somebody has collected that material because of some sort of discourse involving the word shu. And I don't know if that's the case or not, but it's a interesting question to look at. And when we just need to see what kinds of arguments we can come up with in terms of interpreting those things as related in that way. And are the arguments merely speculative, or can we make a claim that they are the best explanation? When I say inference to the best explanation is a methodological principle, what I mean is that all of our interpretive hypotheses, among other things, are inherently comparative. So, I might offer a plausible interpretation of some passage, and you might say, well, that's plausible, but I can think of 3 other equally plausible interpretations. In that case, mine is not justified. Merely being plausible isn't enough to justify it. It has to have something that makes it a somewhat better, interpretation. And of course, in working with all early Chinese texts, the problem is that from time to time, we just get stuck and we can't come up with a significantly better interpretation. We just don't have enough data to work with.
Hi, Chris. I didn't have a question earlier just because I've never been in this situation before where I'm giving a paper on a similar kind of synthetic kind of approach to these chapters where so much of my paper has been rendered redundant by previous paper. No. Which is to say that I really liked a lot of what you said, and I think you point out a lot of problems with the kind of stratification approaches and many of the same problems I see. I just wanted, though, to point out that I think that already here we're doing something that I think Wim's question goes very well with the previous point that we were talking about the difference between the kind of reasons that a particular passage or pericope was originally written versus the rationale for it being included in a bricolage that forms, either a run of pericopes or an entire chapter within the Zhuāngzǐ. And so much of the work that's done in these stratification exercises is simply to find the presence of an idea or the presence of a particular phrase. But what that does is just then presence is then evidence of a particular orientation. And I think that by distinguishing between the kind of bricks and the mortar, of the way these are put together, we're already getting to something that I think is a much more historically kind of precise and I think more rigorous kind of way of looking at this. And so I think some of these points about the difference between kind of authorial intent on particular things and then editorial intent in terms of weaving them together is a good one.
Yeah, I completely agree. All I would underscore is that sometimes, justifying a hypothesis about that distinction can be very challenging. But if there's ways, when we can look at something and say, look, here's this pericope, and just taken on its own, it looks like the best explanation would be such and such. And now it's been fit in here with these several other things, and it kind of takes on a new significance because of what it's been placed adjacent to and how it's been, pasted into this collage. If we can do that in some instances, wow, what an amazing, deeper and richer understanding of the material we're gaining by doing so. Yeah.
Okay. there is a question from Tobias. Hi.
Hi, Chris. I have a question for you. So you use largely language-based categories to create such connections between passages in the Zhuāngzǐ, right? I mean, you could talk about it as discourse. My question to you is, are you also considering discourse as being something bigger than just language-based frameworks? Let's say something like style, poetic form, aesthetics, as a framework to organize the Zhuāngzǐ, or did you not basically think that is a meaningful way of engaging with the text beyond, let's say, concepts and terms, as it would be typical, right, for the discipline of philosophy in this case?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I don't do that because I lack the competence. I don't understand old Chinese rhyming schemes. In the case of the Mozi, I'm able to do that a bit because it's considerably easier there. Well, I mean, in the Mozi, there are really clear usage patterns in a few places. But in the Zhuāngzǐ, it's much more mixed up. So, if there are colleagues with that competence who can do that sort of thing, I think it's very interesting. Just tentatively, I would say no one has successfully done that yet. And maybe it's because the material is just too difficult to work with, or maybe there aren't enough patterns there. I mean, David McCraw has that book on stratifying the Zhuāngzǐ where he uses, rhyming schemes. And he assembles a lot of data, and it's all very suggestive, but I don't think anybody feels that it actually establishes anything. The usage patterns that Graham tried to trace, honestly, Bruce Brooks just showed that none of that worked back in 1996. And the usage patterns that Liu Xiaogan has attempted to use, I guess I showed in 1997 that none of that was going to work either. So, it's tantalizing. I'd love to see work along those lines that was able to divide different pericopes into different groupings. I'm skeptical that it can happen, although it would be great if it did. Yeah.
I was just wondering in sense of like imagery, for example, right? That you group them based on, not on the discourse, but on imagery, for example. It's just a simple example, not just so much, like figuring out whether there are like text patterns in some form, right? Or like on a linguistic level, clear-cut linguistic level, but like, you organize it according to deformations, right? Or like any kind of tropes, topics in that sense that manifest in more than just terminological ways in the Zhuāngzǐ.
Yeah, I think it's definitely interesting to look at that, and not only that, but that might point the way toward lines of literary influence. What I mean by that is, if you've never read the Zhuāngzǐ before, and you come across the opening of Qi Wu Lun, and you've got this guy there, sitting there, kind of, losing himself in a kind of meditation, and then there's a person standing by and says, what's going on here? You might think that's a one-off, and then you read carefully through the whole Zhuāngzǐ and you realize it's a trope that gets used again and again and again, right? And say, okay, is there any deeper story we can tell about that trope? I don't have one, but if someone were to come up with one, that would be really interesting, right? And of course, there's that lovely observation that the story of boring the holes for the sense organs in Primal Chaos at the conclusion of Book 7, it's the seventh story in the seventh book, and they they bore 7 holes in the guy's head, and then on the 7th day he dies. Okay, that can't be an accident, right? I'm not sure what to do with that observation, but surely it's meaningful. If someone can figure out how to piece it together with some other interesting observations.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Zhuāngzǐ, and I think I haven't seen you before. And thanks for your great talk. And my questions, one is very specific, and the other one is more general. The first one is, you describe the Xing ethic as somehow the characteristic of Xing ethic is rejecting wrong E and depreciate the sage rulers and so on and so forth. And the reason I'm asking is there any exception to this Xing ethic as you described? Because the reason I'm asking is I'm reading chapter 16, Shanxing, and in that part there's a wrong E, and it seems that the interpreters have kind of different view about, some people think this reading the wrong E as a positively and some are negatively, but if you define the Xing ethic is negating the wrong E, and that it gives somehow definite answers to that part. So this is one specific question. And the other one is the periscopic views is really, I think it helps us to understand the nature of this complicated text. But can we get what would be the kind of philosophical implication we can get out of this reading or understanding the complex nature of the text? What would be, what do you think? Thank you.
Okay, so the first question was, I gave those broad descriptions like Xing discourse, and I said by and large, in what I'm calling the Xing discourse, they deprecate the three dynasties, sage kings. I mean, sometimes they valorize some earlier, more mythical figures, and they generally reject conventional moral values such as Ren and Yi as interfering or harming or Xing in some way. And I don't want to suggest that this is absolutely exceptionless. I want to say that's a general description, but perhaps we can find exceptions. And 16.1, it is one of the challenging bits, right? Because in the table I circulated, I said in 16.1 you have a syncretic tendency combined with Xing, and it's really kind of unique that way. That's a rather special pericope. Or 16.1 and 2, if we want to consider them together. So yeah, I mean, if I were writing a paper about the Xing discourse, I'd talk about what's going on in 8, 9, and 10 or whatever, and then what's going on in the heaven chapters, and then you'd want a section about this special chapter, and try to offer an explanation as to why they partly overlap, but then partly stand out. So if it's a discourse, there's a conversation out there, nobody's going to be able to rule out what one further participant in the discourse is going to say. That's always a live possibility. And the interesting question then, I guess, is, okay, so why do some of the Xing people see it as incompatible with these conventional moral values? But then the voice in Shanxing in 16 thinks it is compatible. Why do they disagree? Where do they disagree? And those are interesting interpretive questions to ask. If I understood your more general question, it was, what do we do philosophically? Where do we go from here if we're reading it as individual pericopes? A lot of people are very uncomfortable with this approach to the Zhuāngzǐ because they really want to have a particular grouping of texts that they can attribute to one figure from which they can extract some sort of coherent position. And my aim is, I hope we can sort of transform our discourse about this text and about the thought that we find in this text and certainly other early Chinese texts. Nobody seems to find it too difficult to talk about the Mozi as a collection of different views. Because, we look at the Mozi anti-war views, and it's very, very clear that they evolved over time and that they started off with certain blind spots and got into debates, and people pointed out to them that there were problems with their position, and so they refined it in various ways. At least in that case, I guess we're talking about a group of people who, although they didn't always agree, did identify themselves as a school of thought, and they actually used the word mo for themselves. So I guess what's so much more difficult about that when we turn to the Zhuāngzǐ is, we don't think this was one sort of organized school. It might have been a number of overlapping circles of like-minded people, and they certainly didn't have a label for themselves. So it's going to be much, much harder to pin down what's going on. And what I would suggest is, okay, let's just stop talking about them as if they all have to converge on some sort of unified position. We can just do philosophical interpretation by talking about the threads and the discourses, right? We can say, you know, these people were interested in this problem, and this was a problem because of these various premises that contributed to the formation of the problem. And some of these people proposed to handle it this way, and others proposed to handle it this other way. And by the way, there's this other thing they say, which can be read as complementing that, you know, in various ways. And I think we can do that without necessarily having to attribute, you know, one coherent integral position to any one particular part of the text. And in our own work, I mean, so I'm you know, primarily in a department of philosophy, so I don't have to come up with a coherent interpretation of the Zhuāngzǐ. I can say, here's a bunch of ideas from Zhuāngzǐ, and now I'm going to explore, for my own interest, relations between these ideas, without claiming that you know, the position I'm going to talk about was actually held by any historical person. Just in terms of understanding the thought, we can do that.
I thought we have plenty of time, but now I found that 7 minutes or so. So I think we should draw more attention from online participants first, because we fully enjoyed. So Brooke, do you have any questions or comments? You must have.
Yeah, sure. But I mean, some of this will, oh, I am the great and mighty Oz. This is nice. I have some things that maybe segue into what I was going to address. I mean, but I can do them now, but I'd rather leave, if there are others who have questions, they can go ahead. And in my time, I'll start by...
Wow, yeah, that is also a good idea. So anyone? Yeah, don't miss the chance, especially the student. You don't have? It's now or never. 7 messages. Can you check very quickly? There seems to be no question because this is an engineer room, so they didn't click. So I think, okay, really? You don't have more question? I'm actually, I fully enjoyed actually. Before I have some kind of resistance a little bit. Pericope, what is pericope? Something like that. But after our conversation, discussion, actually, I'm kind of very, aligned with. But one question maybe as a educator, and then usually I think not only me, including me and I mean most of the participants, including Chris, and in classroom we cannot have this kind of chance to really deeply analyze all the text and then explore the complication of Zhuāngzǐ, right? So usually we are, so for me, I'm actually calling my teaching and reading as a pedagogical reading. Because, do you understand what I mean, right? So we actually, chose, select some very kind of main point or significant point we think of, and then teach them, right? Teach Zhuāngzǐ for them. So what is your strategy, Chris? When you teach Zhuāngzǐ, your pericope and this kind of complicated reading, how do you define or explain your reading can be helpful for students for the educational purpose or pedagogical kind of purpose?
It may seem very complicated, but I actually do teach the Zhuāngzǐ this way. I discourage students from ever talking about Zhuāngzǐ as if that was a person who wrote a book that we're studying. So we don't talk about it as a book. I teach early Chinese philosophy in philosophy departments, so I set it up as a series of problems and questions that people at the time were discussing. And one of the central ones is, what is Tao, and what is the very nature of Tao, and how could you bring yourself to follow a Tao, and that sort of thing. And then I point out that, in the Zhuāngzǐ, you have this variety of views about that question. And that some of them are very creative and very interesting. And that you can, of course, you can combine some of them in various ways. They complement each other. And so we just, go through selected portions of the text. All of us have this experience. When you're teaching the Zhuāngzǐ, you're never going to have time to cover the whole thing. You've got to select some of the parts you think are most interesting. Almost all of us are going to say, books 1, 2, and 3, maybe book 4, parts of book 5. Those are pretty damn interesting. But I would always also include 17. And just say, look at how these different, pericopes, how they're approaching these problems from different perspectives, and what they're doing, how they're proposing to solve them, or how they're treating that, or how they're introducing interesting concepts. And there's no reason not to look at complementary relations, like how, for instance, the idea of wandering about and wandering, transformations, and dependence certainly intersect in various ways with the story of the big gourds in Xiaoyaoyou. Students find it fruitful to see how that might relate. But then I would also introduce threads, like the whole thread of use and uselessness. Students love that, right? And just tell them, look, we're going to look at this and this and this and this, and you can see for yourself how there's this conversation going on about use and uselessness. And then always include as well 山木篇, 第一节, all right, section 1 from book 20, where you get this reflection on whether there's any way to appeal to use and uselessness to provide any kind of fixed guide to conduct. So I think that we can tell students, look, this is a very rich text. It's got all this stuff going on in it. And as a group, we can, select a few topics and a few different contributions to those topics to help us appreciate the richness of the material.